Okay. So now we are down on Daf Kuf Mem Gimel Amud Bet, and we just said from Nachman Yitzchak the machloket between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim in regards to drinking the juices that flowed out was machloket by tutim and rimonim. That there are some people that drink them. It's not like grapes and olives that most people juice them, and it's not like other fruits that almost nobody. It's not the derech at all, but it's some people. Therefore, Rabbi Yehuda says that if it's le'ochlin, if you bought it le'ochlin, it depends what you bought the tutim v'rimonim for. If you bought them le'ochlin, then it's fine to drink their juices that flow out by themselves. And Chachamim hold that regardless, it's going to be a problem. Okay, so the Gemara says that he wants to bring a proof from a Braita. The Tanya is Zeitim shemashach mehem shem v'anavim shemashach min yayin. Zeitim that you mashach from them shemen, anavim that you mashach that you drew out from them wine. And how? Because they just came out by themselves. Mashach sometimes could mean by itself. Whether you brought them to your home, whether you brought these fruits to your home for ochel or for mashkin, asur, whatever comes out of them is asur. Doesn't matter, regardless. Tutim shemashach mehem mayin, v'rimonim shemashach mehem yayin. Now, what about if you have berries? Their water, their juices came out of them. Or rimonim, that wine came out of them, which means pomegranate juice. And Rashi says, why is it called the end of that Rashi, the end of the Rashi, Vichnisan, he says the reason why it's called yayin by rimonim because it has a little bit of a vinegary, sour taste. So it had some sort of a wine taste. They actually make wine out of pomegranates, you know that today. Mm-hmm. But that they can make out of anything really. You know, that's not what this means. This means just regular juices. Vichnisan ochlin. Oh, if you bring them in for ochlin, ayotzim hem mutar. Whatever comes out of them is mutar. Lemashkin v'listam, or he didn't say what he wants, ayotzim mehen asur. Okay. Even if he doesn't say anything, it's as if he wants to juice them. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Chachamim omrim bein lochlin bein lemashkin ayotzim mehen asur. Whether it was, even if it's la'ochlin, from tutim rimonim, it's going to be asur. So you see clearly that the machloket between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim are specifically in the case of tutim and rimonim la'achila. Now the question is, Rashi says, this Braita here is beferush, like Rav Nachman Yitzchak just explained, right? What did Rav Nachman Yitzchak say? He said, Mistabra betutim v'rimonim plig. I would assume that they argue by tutim v'rimonim. What do you mean you would assume? The Tanya, because I see clearly. You should say, betutim v'rimonim pligi for sure. So Rashi says, Mistabra betutim v'rimonim pligi, the ikad the bowl who the mashkin hilchel mashal derban kadeis v'anav v'kreviu the palagalei. Aval shaper is lekel the boy of the who the mashkin hilchel moed rabbanon b'hem. Now look at the next Rashi. V'chachamim omrim v'had denakat of nach lishud the mistabra v'lo omar behedi the betutim v'rimonim pligi. Why doesn't he say it straight up? Mishum the ikad the name pligi betutim v'rimonim vodim l'shaperot. It's possible to say that he argues elsewhere too. The only reason why it picked tutim v'rimonim in the Braita, it's possible. It's not mistaber. It's It's mistabra to say that the Braita picked it because that's where they argue, and only there. But it is possible that the Braita picked it to teach you how great Rabbi Yehuda's shita is. That not only does he say that it's mutar by all other fruits, which almost nobody juices, if you bring them for achilah, but even by tutim rimonim, that some people do juice, if you brought them in for achilah, it's going to be mutar. And then Rashi asks, what about then Rashi asks another kasha that we'll see in a second. Okay? That's the answer to the kasha. So it's not 100% raya, but it's very mistaber. It's very reasonable to assume that this Braita is a proof. Okay. So now, now the Gemara is like this. The Braita said over here that if you one added little thing. It said if you brought them in for ochlin, Rabbi Yehuda says it's mutar. If you brought them in for mashkin, it's going to be asur. But if you notice, the Braita said something else. Vilistam. Mazalomar. What does that mean? Vilistam. That means you brought them in for nothing. You didn't. They're good. Just bring them home. We're not thinking you want to eat them, you want to juice them. You brought them home because you brought them home. Could be that you grow them. You brought this pile home. You didn't have a specific intent of what you want to do. So what did Rabbi Yehuda say there? Even Rabbi Yehuda, that allows when you bring them in for achilah, here he said it's asur if it flows out. There, if you drink, there is a gzeirah that midrabanan that you might come to squeeze them. Now, that's a very interesting thing, right? Why? Because that means that you're saying that that normal tutim limonim juices have a halacha like, let's see, have a halacha like juice. Fact, the Gemara kash v'sav Rabbi Yehuda stam asur. Are you telling me from that Braita, which seems like the Braita is saying that stam is asur to drink the juices because we give it a halacha as if you brought the tutim rimonim into juice. Ve'atanan, or you to the Mishnah, a lady's milk is mitamei l'ratzon v'shelo l'ratzon. Whether the milk came from the lady l'ratzon because she wanted it to come from her, or even shelo l'ratzon, or even if she didn't want it to come from her, she didn't want the milk to come out, but it came out anyways. So we know that in order to make things tamei, you need things that grow from the ground. They need to come in contact with one of the 7 mashkim, 7 liquids that the Torah renders as the liquids that can by touching other things, they can render other things at least that it should be susceptible to contract tuma. But the Mishnah says that chalev ha'isha, in order for it to become morning David, in order for the milk of the lady to become real milk, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter how it comes out, whether it comes out of her with her consent, without her consent. Chalev behema, however, eno mitameh elim ken yatal l'ratzon, unless it came out of the behema with the consent of the owner of the animal, and if not, it's not considered a mashke. So, and now there's another halacha that there's another halacha of mashke. Besides the fact that the mashke is able to make other things susceptible to contract tumah, it also has to be considered a mashke for it itself to be mekabel tumah, for it itself to become tameh. So this halacha can also be applied here. That chalev isha, it doesn't matter if she extracted it biratzon, through her child, through herself, or it came out shalol ratzon, it's always going to be considered, chalav, that makes other things susceptible to contract tumah. And it will also be the chalav that can be mikabel tumah. However, the behemah milk, right, animal milk we have at home, is only if the owner wants it to come out. Then we consider it mashke. Now that it's mashke, there's two halachas. One is that if it touches something that grew from the ground, that thing is susceptible to tumah. And also that the milk, the behemoth milk itself,
Sorry.
No problem.
It's on my mind too much.
The umam.
You see?
Oh my! So the milk itself, it can become tameh. It's good. It's turning me into a breast. Okay, fine. So now it turns into a mashke that can itself be mekabel tumah, and it can make other things susceptible to tumah. Which means if a dead sheretz touches this milk, it will become tameh. And now it can also make other things tameh, even if the sheretz doesn't touch it. However, if not, it cannot become tameh, and therefore it cannot make other things susceptible to tumah. Omar Rabbi Akiva. So Rabbi Akiva said, what's the reason that a lady's milk is rendered as real chashuv milk, even if it came out of the lady without consent? Is because it's very, very chashuv. It's chashuv. It's significant. It's important. It's not just an animal's milk, it's a lady's milk. So Rabbi Akiva said, what's greater? The milk of an animal or milk of surprise.
One day extension.
Oh wow. Baruch Hashem. What's greater? The milk of a lady or the milk of an animal? Says so the Gemara sounded like what? The Mishnah Braita said that the milk of a lady is one of the 7 liquids that can make other things susceptible for tumah. If you have an apple, you took off the tree, and the apple comes into contact with tumah, it will not become tameh unless it first became wet with one of the 7 liquids. One of them is milk. So the first shita in the Chachamim, they said, milk of a human, right, of a lady, even if it comes out of the lady without consent, it's considered milk. And if it touches something else now, it's going to render it susceptible to become tameh, and it itself now can become tameh because it's real chalav. But an animal's is only milk if the owner squeezed it out, or he wanted it to come out, right? But if not. So Rabbi Akiva says, Rabbi Akiva kal v'chomeru. ומאכל לאישה שאינו מיוחד אלא קטן מטעם לרצון ושלא לרצון חלב הבהמה שמיוחד בין לקטן ובין לגדול מן הדין שיטעם בין לרצון ושלא לרצון. Who drinks a lady's milk? Only a child. And still You're telling me that even if it comes out shalol l'ratzon, it's going to be considered chashuv, right? So for sure, an animal's milk, which is fit for little children and for gedolim, right? For sure, it should be considered milk. Amulois, the Chacham said back, Timei chaleva isha shalei ratzoin, shedam magafoso tomei. You know why the chaleva isha is more chashuv, and even if it comes out shalei ratzoin? Because the dam that comes out of her wound is tamei. Since the blood of a lady is also one of the 7 liquids, the blood of a human, I consider one of the 7 liquids that can make things susceptible to tumah. And when does blood come out of a person? Shalai l'ratzon. If you get a wound, you don't want it to happen. Therefore, the milk source is really from her blood, because the Gemara holds that the milk is blood that became milk. That's what milk is. So therefore, that's why it's going to be tamei. But yetame chalev behema shaloi l'ratzon. But that's not going to make the chalev behema be tamei shaloi l'ratzon. Shedam agafos hator, because the blood of an animal is tahor. It's not one of the 7 liquids. The 7 liquids has to be the dam chalolim yishtu. We learn out of a pasuk. And therefore, that's only talking about a human blood and not the blood of an animal. So therefore, the Gemara is answering as follows: that Bilam said, "V'dam chalalim yishteh," and what was Bilam saying? That the Klal Yisrael is going to destroy their enemies, and they're going to inherit all of their assets. Just like a lion drinks its victim's blood. V'dam chalalim yishteh. So too we're going to drink our victim's blood. Ki'ilu. All of their blood means all their assets and their wealth we're going to take home. Now that blood is yishteh, we'll drink. So you see that it's a shtiyah. You see that blood has a din of a mashke. That's what we learn from this pasuk. So now the Gemara also learns in Nida that it happens even if it's shaloi l'ratzon, if it comes out of a chabura, comes out of a wound which you don't want. Okay, because over there a chalalim. What's the difference between if you do a chalalim is a dead person and there's a lot of blood coming from him, or you do a little wound which is also a death, because every drop of blood is death. It's a nefesh. So therefore, the Gemara learns out that every wound is like v'dam chalalim yishteh, which has a din of a shtiyah, which has a din of a mashke, and that's the halachas that we learn out. Obviously, that's what the Torah teaches a yid. You know, can you imagine if a guy had the Torah, he would just go ahead and start drinking the blood of his victim. But we know that what the pasuk is telling v'dam chalalim yishteh is just to make a halacha that has a din of shtiyah for the halachas of tumah. And it goes even on a chabura. Okay? So, therefore, that's the whole source that the milk of a lady is tamei, is a mashke, and it can make things tamei. Why? Because it comes from the blood. So therefore, even if it comes out shalol l'ratzon, just like by the blood, but the dam of the chalev behema, yeah, but the chalev behema, says the Gemara, which the halacha is that if the blood of an animal doesn't have a din, that it's mitameh. So therefore, the milk of the animal cannot be derived from the fact that the blood of the animal, because the blood of the animal doesn't make anything tamei. Therefore, that's why the halachas of the milk of an animal have to be dafka b'ratzon and not shelo b'ratzon. It's only by a lady where we find shelo b'ratzon already. Where do we find shelo b'ratzon? By her blood. We don't find that by the animal. Omar lohen. So Rabbi Kiva answered them, Machmir ani b'cholav v'b'dam. I actually would be more machmir by cholav than by blood in regard to tumah. Shehacholev l'refuah. If someone milks an animal for refuah, because you have to make sure she doesn't get sick if she gathers too much milk, then tameh. Then the milk that you squeeze out of the animal, you milk her, is going to be tameh in regards to tumah. Because at the end of the day, you wanted it to come out, so you squeezed it out. V'hamakiz l'refuah tahor. But if you do some bloodletting on an animal for what? Curative measures, tahor. Because the blood of an animal is not considered a mashke l'tumah. So you see that the Torah was more machmir about milk than blood. And therefore, says Rabbi Kiva, since I say the Torah was more machmir about the milk than about the blood, even if I do both of them l'ratzon and I want them to come out, therefore I would like to render the milk of an animal like a mashke, even if it doesn't come out l'ratzon, even though we find that the blood of an animal is not considered a mashke at all. He says, and the reason why, Rabbi Kiva says, is because you see clearly that when I do both of them l'ratzon, it still doesn't help the blood. And the milk is rendered as a mashke, and the blood is not. So we see clearly that in regards to the behema, the dam is not as chashuv as the chalav. Therefore, there's no comparison. You can't compare the chalav to the dam, and therefore I can very well say that the chalav will be considered a mashke even if it comes out shelo l'ratzon. And therefore he yeah. Therefore, he's telling the Chachamim you should make this kal v'chomer between the mashke of a behema to a mashke of an adam. They told him back, I'll show you from the baskets of grapes and olives that you cannot compare liquids that come out without ratzon abaylim to mashkim that are yotel ratzon. Rabbi Kiva wants to make everything the same, right? Even if it comes out shelo l'ratzon by the animal. What do you see? She'amashkin hayotzim him l'ratzon tameim. Shelo l'ratzon tehorim. Let's say a person tries to extract all the mashkin that comes out of these baskets, l'ratzon. He wants it to come out. The halacha is it's going to be tameh. But if it's shaloi l'ratzon, they're tahirim. They don't have a halacha of mashkin, and therefore you see that there's a chilik between l'ratzon and shaloi l'ratzon. Why are you so sure that by the chalev behema it's going to be considered a mashke even if it comes out without his consent? So now, okay, fine. That was that Mishnah. The machlokes if chalev behema will be considered chalav l'ratzon or shaloi ratzon. Why does this have anything to do with Rabbi Yehuda said? Rabbi Yehuda told us in our brayta that we had before that if you bring home berries or pomegranates and you don't bring them home for any specific intended purpose, you don't bring them home specifically for what? For eating or for drinking, the halacha is that anything that oozes out of them is going to be prohibited to be consumed on Shabbat, because lest he comes to squeeze more. And Rabbi Yehuda was pretty lenient, and he said that if it's for ochlin, if you bring it home for food, you could. If you bring it home for drink, you can't. What about if you don't bring it home for any intended purpose? He said you can't. Okay, he considered it like leschita. So the Gemara is asking like this: My love, liratzon denichale. What does it mean when the Mishnah said by the salei zeitin va'anavim? What does it mean that you got the juices out of the baskets of zeitin va'anavim liratzon? It means denichale. That means he's very happy that they came out. Shalol liratzon. What does shalol liratzon mean? Bistama. He didn't say that he wants the juices to come out. He didn't say he didn't want them. Stam. So you see clearly that if you don't say anything, we consider it shalol l'ritzono, and they're not considered mashkin in regards to tumah. So now, that means if you have baskets of zaitim ve'anavim, and from those baskets some liquids come out, okay, they're only tameh and they're only considered real liquid if it was liratzon. If the juices came out liratzon, but if they just come out stam without thinking anything, they're not considered mashkin. If zaitim v'anavim, which are made primarily to be squeezed, to be juiced, but if they came out shaloi l'ratzon, what does shaloi l'ratzon mean now? Just stam. I never intended that for them to really come out. They're not considered v'lo klum. They're not considered liquids for tuma at all. They're not considered mashkin, liquids that can render other things susceptible, or that they themselves can become tamei. To tivri monim delav b'nei schitanin ulekoshkein. Berries and pomegranates that are not made primarily, even though some people do, but primarily they're not made to be juiced. How much more so should we say that the juices that are extracted for them bistam, without you indicating that you want it to come out, for sure shouldn't have halacha like real mashkin. Therefore, how could the Braita say before that in the name of Yehuda that if you brought home tutim v'rimonim and you didn't really express any intention, whether you want it for intended purpose, whether you want it for achil or schita, then the mashkin that flows from them is going to be asur, because we're worried now that he might come to squeeze them. But that's clearly contradicted by the Mishnah here that says that when they come out bistam, even by zaitin v'anavim, we consider it shalol l'ritzono. Okay? So the Gemara says, Lo, liratzon bistama, shalol l'ritzon degali adaite. You know what liratzon means when it says zaitin v'anavim? Liratzon means without thinking anything. Then we consider that you want it by zaitin v'anavim. And bistama, when it says bistama, it means shalol l'ratzon. The goliath daite, he said clearly, I don't want them to flow out. Because if you don't want them to flow out, then we consider shalol l'ratzon. So there's no proof from this Braita, because this Mishnah over here that said that Salei Zeitim V'Anovim Hamashkin HaYotzim Hem L'Rotzoin means stam. And therefore, what we're saying now is that even though it's talking about Zeitim V'Anavim, but the same thing will be by Tutim V'Remonim. If a person doesn't say anything, even according to Rabbi Yehuda, even by Tutim V'Remonim, we're going to consider it that he wants it to come out, and therefore we consider them mashkin. Okay? And when it says bistama, when it says shalol l'ratzon, that he doesn't want to come out, shalol l'ratzon When it said liratzon tmein, that's bistama. And shelo liratzon is specifically when he says clearly, I don't want. So when it says ratzon, it doesn't mean he has to verbally say, I want it for that. It means that's the stam. Zaytim v'anavim stam. And the same thing with by tutim v'rimonim, the stam will already be considered l'schita. Shelo l'ratzon means, lehedya, he says, I don't want it. V'iba itema, says the Gemara, another teretz. Shani sali zaytim v'anavim, the kim del ibud kaimimi, koraf kuri mafkelo. Another teretz is, you don't have to change around the meaning in the Braita, in the Mishnah, when it says to say that when it says liratzon, it means stama. No, you could say that ratzon in the Mishnah really means ratzon, that he said, I want to squeeze the sali zaytim avim, and that's why they become mashkin. But the reason why he has to do that, even though Rabbi Yehuda said by tutim v'rimonim bistama, already it's going to be considered mashkin, is because the bailim, the owner knows that on the way to the wine press, or everywhere, right, there's going to be a lot of drippings that are going to come out of the baskets. And they're going to be lost. They're just going to drip on the ground. And therefore he's mafkadim. He's mesiach dat. Which means that liratzon means that he has to want them to come out. And shelo liratzon means bistama. This way we learned it initially. But still, the norm by Zaytim Novim is as if he said, I'm not interested. You know why? Because they're bound to drip on the ground. And therefore, he probably, in the normal case, in that case, does not want whatever is dripping out of it. That's the norm. And Ratzon has to be that he actually says that he wants it. But our Braita is talking about perot, which are put not into baskets. They're put into real vessels. So whatever drips out of them is not going to just drip on the ground and get lost. So there, the stama is actually that he does want it. Because there's no reason to assume that whatever drips out, he just forgets about. Why should he forget about it? It's gathered on the bottom of the keli. It's stored for him. And therefore, that's why Rabbi Yehuda holds that the stam of tutim v'rimonim is the schita, and he's happy about those anovim, about the mashkim hayotzim hen, and therefore there's a gzeira midrabanan not to drink it because he might come to squeeze the rest out of it. Okay. Now the Gemara said that the machlokes again between Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanon is where? Specifically by the middle class group of fruits. Middle class fruits are the ones that some people squeeze, most people don't. Zaytim v'anavim is primarily squeezed, that everyone agrees. Even if you brought them home for oichlin, it will be a problem. And all other fruits, at least in those days, right? These days things changed drastically because there's a lot of fruits that are like tusim v'rimonim, like apples, oranges. We make apple juice, we make orange juice, even if it's not the primary usage, but there's plenty of it. And maybe now oranges might be even more, I don't know, maybe more for orange juice, I don't know. But in those days, all other fruits, the Chachamim were moeded to Rabbi Yehuda, that you have to specifically bring them home, l'mashkin. Right. And by Zaytim v'anovim, Rabbi Yehuda was moeded to the Chachamim, that even if you brought them in for oichlin, it's going to be a problem. Where's the machlokes? Whether the fact that you brought them home to eat makes a difference by tutim v'rimonim, by the middle class, where primarily they are eating. So if you brought them home for eating, Rabbi Yehuda says that's okay. The Chachamim say no. Since there are people that squeeze them, if the juices come out, it's still asur to drink them, because you might end up squeezing them. It says the Gemara, Ashkecha Rabbi Yehuda demoed the Rabbanan b'zeisim v'anov. So we see over here that the Rabbanon HaMoedeh from this bright that Nachman Yitzchak brought before of Zaitim shemashach mehem shemen v'anavim shemashach mehem yayin. So over there we see that the Chachamim are moed, that we see that Rabbi Yehuda is moed by Zaitim v'anavim, whether you brought them in for oichel or for mashkin. Even Rabbi Yehuda says that it's going to be a problem if they come out. That means even if you brought home grapes or olives to eat, but some of the juices came out into a keli, you're not allowed to drink them. How do we see that? Because the Braita says beferish. Everybody says it's asur. Okay? But where do you know? Where do you see? There's nothing mentioned in that Braita about other fruits, about the third class. The ones that are not squeezed at all, not juiced at all by anybody. Where do we see that the Chachamim are moedeh to Rabbi Yehuda, that there, if you brought them in for oichlin, which is what 99% of the people do, that the Chacham are going to be moedeh that if the juices come out, they're not considered juices, and you don't worry about squeezing. The Tanya, because we're to the Braita, soichdin befigin uvefrishin uveuzdarin. Figin are plums, frishin are lemons, uveuzdarin are wild apples, like wild apples. I think that's what they are. Now, you're allowed to squeeze these. Okay, so are you allowed to squeeze these on Shabbat? Avalo b'rimonim, but not on rimonim. So, why are you allowed to squeeze these on Shabbat? Because what is the issur of squeezing a fruit on Shabbat? What is that problem? It's called schita. It's called dash, mifarek. Mifarek means you're extracting something that is encased in its casing, right? But the only way, let me ask you a question. If you take a piece of apple, the apple inside, it's encased, right? Inside the peel. And I go ahead and I take a little knife, make a little circle, and I take out a piece of apple. Is that dash? Is that mefarek? Why? I took out something from its casing. I extracted something from its casing. The answer is, it has to be two separate things. One has to be considered like ochel, one has to be considered mashke. So I have liquid inside, absorbed inside its casing, and I extract it, just like the av melacha. Where do we learn it out from? From the wheat. What they have to do? They were threshing. So what are the threshing? You have a casing, the chaff, which is not good. It's going to be thrown out. And then you have the wheat kernel. So you have ochel mitoch a klipa, or you have mashke mitoch ochel. That's why squeezing juices. Now, what about if you have a fruit that's not juiced at all? So the juices now there's juices inside of it, but the juices are not rendered as juices because no one ever drinks them.
Watermelon, maybe? No?
Oh, right. Well, very good. So it gives you a few examples here. People just eat the juices. So they take a bite. The juices, of course, go down. But the point is, the juices have a halachically as an ochel, as a food, not as a liquid, not as a drink, because they're eaten. The juices are eaten. Therefore, when you extract it, you know what you just took out? You took out ochel from ochel. It's like the first example I gave you. It's like taking a piece of apple outside of the apple. That's not a melacha. It's no problem. And that's why the Braita says that if you take these plums and you squeeze them, or lemons, what's chavushim? Lemons, no? Chavushim lemons?
Pickled lemons, I think.
Pickled lemons. Okay. and the wild apples. All these things, if you squeeze the juice out, then you make apple juice, plum juice, pickled lemon juice. All those things are not normally juiced. That you normally eat them. The pickled lemons are the Persians eat them, no? The black lemons, right? So, the Gemara says. So the Gemara says that what? Therefore, the Braita says you're allowed to squeeze them on Shabbat. Avalo b'rimonim, but don't squeeze rimonim, because that's normal. Because there are people, it's not 99.9, 999 or 100%. There are a minority of people that do squeeze them, and that's enough to render their juices as mashke. And therefore, you cannot squeeze them. The people of the house of Menashe bar Menachem would squeeze the Rimonim when? In the weekday. They would make pomegranate juice. Therefore, now, if you find one family, you can't just make the whole Klal Yisrael asur, right? There's always one guy doing everything. So it means, it's just giving an example. And you know that family, Beit Menashe, they do it. That means other people do it. There are people, it's just an example. But many people do it, even though it's a minority. So therefore you see in this Braita that what? That there's no Yistur to squeeze on Shabbat, Peirot that are not normally squeezed. But anything that's anything that you don't usually squeeze and you don't juice, you eat the juices inside the ochel, is allowed to be mamash squeezed. Forget about it. You're allowed to drink it if it oozes out. You're allowed to squeeze it on Shabbat. There's no Isra Schita. So for sure, if it oozes out, you can drink it because you were allowed to squeeze it initially. So here's the Braita that shows that the Chachamim admit to Rabbi Yehuda that all the other types of fruits, not tutim and rimonim, all their juices are not considered juices and there's no gzeira midrabanan. Okay? And this is the shita of Shmuel before, that said that the Chachamim admit to Rabbi Yehuda in other perot, and they only argue by tutim v'romanim. Says the Gemara, Umimai de Rabbanan hi dilma Rabbi Yehuda hi. Who says that Mishnah, that Braita that we just brought, is the Rabbanan? Maybe the Braita is Rabbi Yehuda. And that's why it says that all those other fruits you can actually squeeze. But according to the Chachamim, maybe they're machmir, and they hold there's no difference between tutim v'rimonim or pigin, prishin, uzdarin, and watermelon. All other fruits are also in the category of tutim v'rimonim. So the Gemara says v'tehevi nami Rabbi Yehuda, because the Gemara answers, even if you say that it's Rabbi Yehuda, even if you say that Rabbi Yehuda is the author of that Braita, but there's a major chidush in that Braita, right? Because that Braita is telling you that you're actually allowed to squeeze. All we know from our Mishnah here in Shabbat is that what? That Rabbi Yehuda says if it flows out by itself, you're allowed to drink it. But to say that you're allowed to squeeze, we never saw that in our Mishnah. That's a major chidush. Therefore, so what are you going to say when you see this astounding Braita that says you're allowed to squeeze? That kivon, the lav b'nei schiteninu, afil lichatchila. That since this Braita is telling you, must be telling you a major chiddush, that since nobody squeezes these things at all, okay, on these let's say plums, then afil lichatchila, then you're allowed to squeeze them on Shabbat lichatchila. Therefore, afilu teim rabbanon. So now you could say that the Braita is also going with the shita of the Chacham. The kiva the lav v'nei schiteninu afilu lichatchila shma mino rabbanon. Which means like this. There's no difference. What the Gemara is really trying to say is like this. There's no real difference in how in Svara once you get into this major chiddush. This Braita is telling you a whole new level that you're allowed to actually squeeze. How could you say you're allowed to squeeze? How can you squeeze? It must be that you could render it as totally as an oichel. So if that's what the Braita is saying, there's no reason to assume that the Chacham disagree with that. Why would we say that they argue about that they let a mamish squeeze, it must be it's an oichel. So once we say that, and we say that the Chacham hold like that, therefore there's no reason to assume that the Chacham will argue about the juices that flow out of them in themselves, if you're allowed to drink them or not. Shema mino. I hope that was very clear, because one last, there's no difference. We never found the difference in Machlokes of Yehuda and the Chacham about squeezing in our Mishnah, what you're allowed to squeeze. We had a Machlokes of what you're allowed to drink, because you might come to squeeze. But in Hilchas squeezing, which this Bright is going, if it says l'chatchila, go ahead and squeeze something, obviously the Bright is telling you that then it's not considered juice at all. There's no reason to assume the Chacham argue on that. We never found such a Machloket. Therefore, we can safely assume that the Chacham will also agree that with that Braita, and therefore, since it's considered ochel, then anything that flows out of it on Shabbat is also considered ochel. There's no gzirah d'Rabbanan. Now the Gemara goes back to what the Braita brought. In the house over there, they would squeeze the rimonim, and that's why rimonim get a different halacha. Get it? They have a different halacha, and that's why you may not squeeze rimonim on Shabbat. Amar Rav Nachman halacha kishabeit Menashe Menachem. The halacha follows that household, since they would squeeze it, and they're just an example for a nice minority. Therefore, on Shabbat, you're not allowed to squeeze any rimonim. Amalei Rav Rav Nachman, Menashe Menachem Tano. You're passing it like Menashe Menachem. Is he a Tano? All we're bringing down from Menashe Menachem is to show that the Tana in the Braita was backing his halacha al pi the minhag of what people did, and he brought an example of this household. Not that household were Chachamim saying any halachas. That's what they did on Wednesday. We're just bringing a minhag. Beis Menashe Bar Menachem, they used to make pomegranate juices on Wednesday. Every Wednesday they had but he's not a Tana. What does it mean? Halacha kibei shel Beis Menashe Bar Menachem. Elamai, you're going to tell me, if you're going to tell me that what it means is halacha ki haytana desavar shel Menashe ben Menachem umishum desavar ki Menashe ben Menachem halacha k'moisei. Menashe ben Menachem avru b'dalma. Elamai, you didn't mean to say that halacha follows him. It means that follows the Tana that went with him. Says the Gemara, is he most of the world? Why should we? What's pshat in that Tana? Why is he deciding halacha that you're not allowed to squeeze rimonim on Shabbat? Because there's a household, Farmer Joe, Farmer Menashe, I don't know if he's a farmer, whatever he was, he made, all we know about Menashe Menachem is that he made pomegranate juices in the weekday. So because of that, now it becomes what the majority of the world does. Says the Gemara, and yes, the Tanan, thanks so much. That's exactly what I did. Thank you very much. Yes. Yes, the classification of a peri is rendered by minorities, by yechidim. Says the Gemara, how do we know? The Tanakh is a Mishnah Kalayim that says like this. Hamekayim kotzim bakerem. If a farmer, someone that owned a vineyard, he left kotzim. Kotzim are thorns to grow amongst his vineyards. Rabbi Elazar Omer, Kiddush. Kiddush means, Kiddush is not a good thing, is a negative thing. Kiddush is, the Torah says, pentikta shamalea, which means if you grow any other growths together with your kerem, that's considered kilayim, it's a forbidden mixture. Okay? And the halacha is that even if you don't plant it, but you see something growing and you allow it, you maintain it, you allow it to stay there, to be sustained, therefore the halacha is it's kilayim as well. So hamikayim koitzim bakerem. If someone allows the koitzim, the thorns, to grow, that's a zera. The Torah says, lo tizra kamecha kilayim. Don't grow your vineyard with any other pentikta shamaleh hazera asher tizra utvuat akarem. Any growths that grow. So Rabbi Lazar says that includes thorns. It's a different min, it's a different species. The thorns are growing, it's a different thing, and it's growing together with your vineyard. It's a problem. And even if you didn't plant it, but you just allow it to stay there, it's a problem. Since people don't usually like thorns in their field, and they don't usually sustain them, therefore, it's not going to make a problem here. Even if you do, leave it there. What's the reason that Rabbi Elazar says that thorns are considered a zera, even though people don't usually leave them there? Because we find in the land of Arabia, maybe that's Saudi Arabia, that they actually like to have thorns in their field in order to feed that to their camels. The camels like eating thorns. So therefore, you see that Rabbi Elazar is rendering the halacha of what is considered a zera, even though most people don't want it in their fields, but since there are places that want it, one place in one area, therefore now the whole world has to render thorns as a real zera, and it's a problem to make your make lime. So here too, Menashe ben Menachem, even though the people of his home are the minority, that's enough. So the Gemara says, Midi Irya, Daravi Asra, Hochabatodai Eitz Kodam. Arabia is a whole place, it's a whole country. So it's the minig of a whole country. A minig of a whole country can be kaveya for the world. But here it's one family. It's one yachid. How could one yachid? Batodai Eitz Kodam. His thoughts should be nullified. Okay? So the Gemara says, Elahainu Taimo. So therefore the Pshat and the Breita and the Pshat of Nachman that is passing like the Breita because of Menashe ben Menachem is another Pshat. It goes like Rav Chisda. The Omer Rav Chisda. Trodin shesochton unistonon b'mikveh poison es hamikveh b'shinimar. Beets that you squeezed and you placed the juices that are coming out of them into a mikveh, they will render the mikveh pasul, unfit to be used as a mikveh, because the halacha is that a mikveh needs 40 sa'ah of water. Okay? And not only water, but it has to have the appearance of water. Okay? And therefore, if the juices of these beets were squeezed and placed into a mikveh, however, for whatever reason, it's going to be pasul. But normally people do not squeeze the juices of these types of beets at all. Okay? So therefore, the Gemara is asking that the beet juice that comes out of this should not be considered juice. It should not be considered juices. So it's not like it has the appearance of another liquid, because the beet juice should not be considered a juice. And if it's not considered a juice, so it doesn't have the appearance of another juice. So what are you going to say? Okay? You know, you're thinking, who cares, right? You're thinking, who cares? What do you mean? It makes the whole mikveh purple or red. So what do I care if it has halacha of a mashke or not? At the end of the day, the mikveh doesn't have an appearance of water. But the halacha is, there's a Mishnah in the 7th parak in Mikvaot, that if your mikveh gets discolored by something that is not considered anything, like you wash some baskets, and there's a residue of the olives in there, so it's brownish, and this color is the mikveh. Your mikveh doesn't look like good, nice water now, but there's no mamoshes that came in. It's no real mashke. It's not like it's not a different juice, so it's not pasul, even though it doesn't look like water. Aha! So the Gemara is asking. So here too, beet juice. Even though you poured a nice amount of beet juice, you poured a nice 2 cups in there. Now it's all turned nice and red, pink inside the mikveh. But if that juice is not considered real mashke, so the discoloration shouldn't bother us. Elamai is l'meimah, says the Gemara. So what are you going to tell me? You're going to have to say, Kivad achshavinu, since the person himself, he gave chashivos, he gave significance to the beet juice, havalu mashke. So we consider it a mashke, meaning for you yourself, you squeezed it, so you now revealed that you want to be to give significance, to give this juice halacha of mashke. Okay, you want to make barsht. You know what barsht is? So that's what this guy's doing now. It seems like it wasn't normal, but this guy decided he wants to try. He heard about a thing that wasn't normal, that he wants to try. So he made a barsht out of this, and then it fell into the mikveh. So therefore, since he wanted it to become mashke, he gives it halacha of mashke. Hochanami here too, in regards to squeezing perot on Shabbat for their juices, kiva de achshavino havalahu mashke. Since you yourself, you're showing that you consider this to be a mashke, havalahu mashke, and therefore, when the Braita says that you're allowed to squeeze lemons, right, or plums, or wild apples, we're talking about not that the guy went ahead and squeezed them to get the juices. If he squeezed them to get the juices, then of course it's going to be a problem. You know why? Because the very fact that you went over to the lemon or to the plum, even though it's not normally squeezed by anybody, and you squeezed it because you want to try plum juice, you decided, and no one does it, but that act of squeezing renders it into mashke, and now it's considered like you're being mifarek, extracting liquids from an ochel, and that is an isser of shchita. So why does the Braita say you're allowed to do it? Because the Braita is not talking about that you squeezed it out for its juices, to drink the juices. The Braita is talking about that the juices were making it too hard to eat. So you wanted to squeeze the juices out so you could be mimatek the peri. You wanted to sweeten the fruit. So then the act of squeezing is what? Is not really rendering the mashke into mashke. And that's why what? That's why it's going to be mutar. Okay? But when the Sefer said, so what did the Sefer say? But you're not allowed to do rimonim. Says the Braita, if you do rimonim, even if you do rimonim not to get the juices out of it, and you do the rimonim just to sweeten the rimon, right? Because it's too sour, the juices, whatever it is. So you want to eat it without the juices. Still, the Braita says it's asur. You know why? Because since there are a few people, like Menashe ben Menachem, that used to make pomegranate juice, so therefore we're worried that you're also going to one day come to squeeze pomegranates like Menashe ben Menachem. This is the problem. Problem's like this. Not that Menashe ben Menachem renders it into juice. If you squeeze it out for non-juice purpose, right, to be matik the peri, it's not going to be considered juice. If you squeeze it out for peris, then you don't need Menashe ben Menachem. You yourself are being machshav it. That's enough gilui das. And if you're doing it just to make the fruit sweeter, because you want to get rid of juices, you don't want to drink the juices, you just want to get rid of the juices so you can eat the thing and it'll be more enjoyable, then it's also not considered that you squeezed juice and you didn't do the isser of shchita. So why the Chacham say it's also to do tusim ribonim? Because since we find that there's a yochid, Menashe ben Menachem, that makes such a juice, so there's such a thing out there. So maybe one day you'll try it too. So therefore, don't even squeeze rimonim when you're doing it to be mimatik the peri. when you're doing it to sweeten the peri, don't even squeeze the rumen in for that, lest you one day come to squeeze it for juices. Why should I imagine that one day he might come? No. You can imagine such a thing. There's a family that does it. That's all it meant to say. The new pshat in the Breita now. Okay. So if Papa says no. Now, where did we prove this from? All this was proven from the fact that the Breita said that it said that if Chizah brought down that the beets that you squeeze, you place into a mikveh, will pass all the mikveh b'shinimara. So we see that there's chashivas that a person himself can make chashivas and consider it a mashke, right? So that's what we predicated our whole shtickle Torah here. So the Gemara says, Rav Papa Amar, no. The reason why it makes the mikveh puzzle is not because the person gives it chashivut. Because simply, nothing to do with the halachas of mashke. You made a whole shtickle Torah over here that really something is not considered mashke, and rimonim is also maybe not considered mashke because of the fact of Menashe bar Menachem. But Menashe bar Menachem is just like a warning that you might become like him, and if you become like him, then and you actually squeeze it for the juices on Shabbat, then you are squeezing real mashke. And how do you know that becomes mashke, even though you're yachid? The answer is because you did it. You did the ma'aseh. Where'd you learn that from? From the beets, from the mikveh. My father says it's not true. The reason why by the beets in the mikveh makes it pasul is because you can't make a mikveh out of beet juice. Let's say you just had beet juice, 40 soft beet juice. You can't go in. It doesn't work because you need mayim. That's not mayim. That's for sure. It's not mayim, right? So therefore, anything that you can't make a mikveh out of is choshev enough to ruin a mikveh if the mikveh looks like it. Meaning if it discolors the mikveh to look like it, and the it is something that you cannot build the mikveh, the chatchila, even if it doesn't have a halacha as mashke, juices. Everything was predicated on the fact that you see that you could turn something into juice if you yourself squeeze it. The Gemara is saying there's no such thing. You don't really turn something into juice when you squeeze it. Rav Papa says. And the only reason why by the mikveh, the beets ruin it is because you can't build the mikveh if it passes it. Now how is Rav Papa going to understand the Brisa before? The only way that a Papa could explain the Brisa, the Rishonim say, is that when we say Menashe bar Menachem, we're not saying, it's not like an emergency light. Menashe bar Menachem does it, you might end up doing it. All it means is the way that I told you all the way at the beginning. He's going to say, not like a Nachman learned. He's going to say the way I told you at the beginning, that all just means, it's an example. It means there's already a nice minority in the world. As you see over there, Menashe bar Menachem, that means it's just like an example, like Haravia. A lot of people do it. That's all it meant, according to Rav Papa. I want to run. I want to go now. Okay? What's that? David just left, right? What's that? Should we start doing the...